I hate foreigner. I hate Krikamba. I hate Kwara. I hate Zai Zai. I don't like foreigner. Foreigner must go to their country. I hate foreigners. I am xenophobic. I hate, again, I hate times and times. I don't know how many times. I hate foreigners. I am xenophobic. I don't like foreigner because foreigners, I don't have a child because of foreigner. Ramaphosa, take these foreigners to their country right now.
This sounds serious, isn't it? Doesn't it sound really serious? Listen to the next.
African brothers, we don't hate you. We are just fixing our country. Thank you, Ghana. Thank you, Ghana, for standing up for your people. Thank you, Ghana, for coming and fetching your people. And we call on all African brothers and sisters to go back to their countries so we can fix South Africa so that you can come back. And also, this should be an inspiration to you guys to go back to your countries and fight for your countries. This should be a learning curve for your governments to start loving its own people. Governments of Africa must start loving it. If we want united Africa, let us unite Africa with proper countries, proper functioning countries. That's all we are asking for. There is no xenophobia, there is no tribalism, and there will be no violence. We are just asking foreigners to leave this country, illegal foreigners, because every country has got laws. Even the laws of your countries are more tougher than our laws. So respect this country. We are men. We are standing up. We are fighting for this country. 30 June is the deadline for every foreigner to have left the country. Thank you very much.
Now, let me begin with a question that may sound uncomfortable, but I think it is a question we have to face. What if South Africans are angry for real reasons, but that anger is being aimed at the wrong people? I'm not saying this to dismiss anyone's suffering. Hospitals are failing, schools are packed, young people have no jobs, and many communities feel abandoned by the people who promised them dignity after apartheid. So when a South African says, "I am angry," I hear that. The anger is not imaginary. But we have to ask something deeper. How did anger built from years of unemployment, corruption, crime, municipal collapse, and broken political promises end up being aimed at a migrant selling tomatoes, running a spaza shop, looking for work, or trying to survive in the same broken economy? Why does the anger fall on migrants, mostly poor African migrants, instead of the people who actually run the country? That is the question at the centre of this first episode of the South Africa File. This channel exists to look beyond the headlines and follow the history, the power, the politics, and the consequences. Today, we are looking at what I call South Africa's xenophobia machine, a system that takes real suffering and turns it into migrant blame. And I use the word machine deliberately, because this is not only about one march, one angry crowd, one political party, or one movement. It is a wider system of blame, where real crisis goes in, migrant anger comes out, and somehow the people who should be held accountable escape again. Before we go further, let me make something clear. This is not an argument that South Africa should have no immigration laws. No serious country works like that. Borders matter, documentation matters, and crime must be dealt with. If someone breaks the law, the state has a duty to act. If someone is undocumented, there must be a lawful process. But that is exactly the point. A lawful process. Not mobs moving through communities. Not vigilantes deciding who belongs and who does not. Not crowds forcing shops to close because the owner has an accent. Not men with sticks presenting themselves as protectors while ordinary people are left wondering whether the law is still in charge. Because once the law is replaced by fear, anyone can become a target. A Zimbabwean, Mozambican, Malawian, Congolese, Nigerian, Somali, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or even a South African who speaks differently, looks different, or is simply mistaken for being foreign. That is why the phrase, "we only target illegal immigrants," may sound neat in a studio interview, but becomes dangerous on the street. A crowd does not begin by checking paperwork. A crowd begins with suspicion. It looks at accent, language, skin, vulnerability, and whether someone has enough protection to fight back. That is the moment when immigration politics becomes xenophobia. Now, look at the current moment. South Africa is seeing renewed anti-migrant mobilisation, with movements like March and Operation Dudula placing undocumented immigration at the centre of public anger. Their message is emotionally powerful. South Africans first, secure the borders, deport undocumented migrants, protect jobs, protect clinics, protect schools. And let us be honest, that message lands because people are desperate to feel that someone is finally listening. If you have been unemployed for years, if your clinic is overcrowded, if crime has damaged your community, and if government only appears during election season, a slogan like South Africans First can feel like recognition. But a feeling can be real and still be manipulated. That is where the machine begins. The public is invited to believe that if migrants disappear, the crisis will disappear with them. But does that claim survive serious questioning? If migrants are the reason South Africans are unemployed, why was unemployment already a structural crisis before this latest wave of anti-migrant mobilisation? If foreign-owned shops are the reason townships are struggling, who designed the township economy in the first place? Who controls the banks, the land, the supply chains, the retail power, the mining wealth, the policy agenda, and the political institutions that decide who gets opportunity and who remains trapped? These are the questions the xenophobia machine does not want people to ask, because once those questions are asked, the anger starts moving upward. And power does not like anger moving upward. It prefers anger moving sideways, from poor South Africans to poor migrants, from the unemployed to the undocumented, from the struggling to the desperate. That is the tragedy at the heart of this crisis. Two groups of people, both fighting to survive, are pushed into conflict while the deeper system remains untouched. So, who is really behind the machine? The first layer is street mobilisation. This is where movements enter communities, organise marches, issue deadlines, confront migrants, pressure shops, and turn immigration enforcement into public spectacle. Groups like Operation Dudula and March present themselves as defenders of ordinary South Africans. And many people believe them because the state has failed so badly that anyone who looks decisive can appear like a saviour. But street power becomes dangerous when it begins to perform the role of the state. Immigration enforcement belongs to lawful institutions. It cannot belong to private groups, political movements, self-appointed community patrols, or people who decide, in the heat of a march, who deserves to remain in the country. The second layer is political amplification. Some political actors have learned that anti-migrant rhetoric travels fast because it creates emotion, produces a slogan, and gives people an enemy. Deport them, close the borders, take back the shops, South Africans first. These lines are easy to say, especially during election seasons and coalition politics, but they do not fix unemployment, rebuild municipalities, prosecute corruption, reform policing, create jobs, or change who owns the economy. They create a target, and for some politicians, that is enough. But politicians are only one part of the gear. There is a local power struggle happening in townships and inner cities that almost no one talks about. And this is where the story becomes even more important. The third layer is local power. Xenophobia is not only national politics, it is also about who controls trading spaces, who controls buildings, who controls local markets, who speaks for the community, and who gains authority by claiming to protect citizens. When a foreign-owned shop is forced to close or looted, who benefits? When a building becomes a target, who wants control over that space? When a local leader suddenly becomes the voice of law and order, what power is being built behind the scenes? Sometimes the answer may involve business competition. Sometimes it may involve local strongmen. Sometimes it may involve political aspirants, community forums, or people trying to build authority from chaos. That is why we must not only ask who is shouting on camera, we must ask who benefits on the ground. The fourth layer is state failure, and this is where we need to be brutally honest. If Home Affairs worked properly, vigilante groups would have less space. If the police were trusted, mobs would have less space. If municipalities functioned, scapegoating would have less space. If borders were professionally managed, panic would have less space. If corruption was punished, public anger would have a real target. When the state fails, someone else steps into the vacuum. But when vigilantes step into that vacuum, they do not simply restore order. They create another form of disorder, one where fear starts to look like authority. The fifth layer is the deeper economic structure. This is the part that is often avoided because it is harder to confront than a foreign shopkeeper. South Africa's crisis is rooted in apartheid spatial planning, land dispossession, racial capitalism, unequal education, deindustrialization, corruption, failed economic transformation, and the people at the top getting rich while everyone else gets squeezed. It is easier to blame a Zimbabwean selling tomatoes than to confront the structure. It is easier to blame a Somali shopkeeper than to ask why township economies remain trapped at the margins. It is easier to blame a Malawian worker than to confront employers who exploit migrant labor to suppress wages. It is easier to blame migrants than to ask why political freedom did not become economic justice for millions of South Africans. That is the painful truth beneath the anger. And this is not new. South Africa's xenophobia did not begin with March and March, Operation Dudula, or the latest wave of anti-migrant protests. The warning signs were already there in the 1990s, soon after democracy, when foreign nationals were blamed for jobs, crime, disease, and pressure on public services. Then came 2008, one of the darkest moments of post-apartheid South Africa. Violence spread through communities, people were killed, homes were burned, shops were looted, and families were displaced. After that came the Dawns, then 2015, then 2019, then Operation Dudula, and now March and March. The names change, but the script keeps returning. Crisis becomes blame, blame becomes mobilisation. Mobilisation becomes fear, fear becomes violence. And after the violence comes condemnation, denial, and silence, until the next round begins. Each time, the public is told that this is not xenophobia, it is law and order. But we have to be honest with ourselves. You cannot defend law and order by replacing the law with street intimidation. You cannot protect citizens by destroying the rights of non-citizens. You cannot fight crime by treating nationality as evidence. Crime is crime, and it requires investigation, evidence, prosecution, and due process. Immigration violations are immigration violations, and they require lawful state procedures. But foreignness cannot become guilt, because once that line is crossed, the danger spreads beyond migrants. The same street power used today against migrants can be used tomorrow against anyone labelled undesirable. That is why this matters for every South African, not only foreigners, because when mob authority grows, the rule of law shrinks. Now, some viewers may still be thinking, but what about undocumented migration? What about crime? What about pressure on services? Those are fair questions, but they have to be asked properly. If undocumented migration is a problem, why is Home Affairs failing? If borders are weak, who is responsible for border management? If employers are hiring undocumented workers and paying them less, why are employers not being punished? If clinics and schools are under pressure, why are public systems so badly managed? If drugs are damaging communities, who protects the networks that move them? The problem is not that people are asking questions. The problem is that they are being given one answer for everything: foreigners. That answer is politically convenient because migrants cannot fix the state, restructure the economy, prosecute corruption, repair local government, or reverse apartheid geography. Blaming them creates emotional satisfaction without structural change. And that is why the machine keeps working. It gives people the feeling of action without touching the real architecture of power. This is not just happening in the streets. It is changing how Africa sees South Africa. South Africa wants to be seen as a continental leader. It speaks in BRICS, speaks about the global South, speaks about Palestine, anti-imperialism, decolonization, and African dignity. But here is the contradiction. How does South Africa claim African leadership while African migrants fear South African streets? How does a country whose liberation struggle was supported by other African nations allow Africans to be treated like invaders? How does Pan-African language survive when African people are attacked in African cities? This is not only domestic politics, it is diplomatic, moral, and historical, and it damages South Africa's standing on the continent. African unity cannot be a speech at a summit and a threat in a township. It has to mean something in real life. So where do we go from here? We start with truth. South Africans are angry for real reasons, but migrants are not the cause of South Africa's crisis. But they must note that migrants did not design apartheid spatial planning, loot state-owned enterprises, collapse municipalities, create mass unemployment, or build one of the most unequal societies in the world. They are not the root cause. They are the scapegoat. When scapegoating becomes accepted as patriotism, violence becomes predictable, and that is why documentation matters. That is why this channel exists. If we only speak after the next attack, we are already late. We need to understand the machinery before the next fire, before the next looted shop, before the next family leaves in fear, before the next person is mistaken for foreign, and before the next politician turns pain into a campaign slogan. So yes, on this channel, we will examine March and March, Operation Dudula, the politicians, the street figures, the state, and the history. But the deeper question will remain the same. Who benefits when South Africans fight the wrong enemy? That is where the real story begins. This is the South Africa File. History, power, politics, consequences. If this conversation matters to you, subscribe to the channel. And I want to ask you honestly, how should South Africa deal with immigration without falling into xenophobia? Put your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation serious, honest, and grounded in evidence.